Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, this is my second video on Teal Swan. Okay, so basically I see three major controversies with Teal Swan. Okay, and I want to set aside three different videos to address these three different controversies. Okay, so the main controversies I see with Teal Swan are, first of all, her allegations of sort of elaborate, extensive satanic sexual abuse when she was a young person. Um, the second would be, and this would be a separate video. The second would be her position on suicide and the ethics of suicide. Okay. And then finally, the third real issue I see with her is the question of whether she's a cult leader and whether that really matters. Okay. So in this video, I'd like to talk a little bit about her upbringing and her allegations of extensive satanic sexual abuse. Okay. So basically, by way of background, okay, and this is based on interviews I've seen with a neighbor that was like a childhood friend. Okay, so it's kind of limited information, but I'm basing this on firsthand interview of someone who had firsthand knowledge of what Teal Swan was like growing up. Okay, so basically she grew up in Utah, in rural Utah. Okay, so she grew up in sort of a country environment, but in an environment, in an atmosphere, a culture that was predominantly Mormon. Okay, but it's noteworthy that Teal Swan's family was not Mormon, and at the same time, they actually were pretty informed about the history of the Mormon Church. So this paints a picture of a family that was pretty sophisticated and actually had knowledge of Mormon history, but wasn't really participating in the Mormon culture. So I think that right there sort of paints a picture of a family that was kind of independent and sophisticated. Okay, in an environment that was probably pretty pretty religious, and also because they're living in the country, probably a little bit unsophisticated. Okay. The other thing I noticed from the interview with a childhood friend of Teal Swan is that Teal Swan was pretty precocious, pretty aggressive, pretty dominant as a young person, and also was kind of a little bit mischievous. She liked to explore pornography at an early age. She was very fearless about approaching the subject of sexuality before she was even sexually developed. And apparently she even had delayed puberty, which is probably interesting because, that probably affected a little bit, probably made her a little bit extra curious about sexuality and maybe a little bit envious. But in the end, it's interesting that even though she was a little bit delayed in her own development, according to her childhood friend, she developed this idea that she was sort of like a sexual goddess and that she had sort of extra special sexual power. And apparently around sexuality, let's say around showing pornography to her friends and just talking about sex, she was very dominant and kind of intimidating around the subject of sex. And she identified with having power around sex. Okay. I mean, I'm assuming this is just in her fantasy. I don't have any idea of actual in real life how dominant or how powerful she is. But she has this idea, this fantasy of having power around sexuality. Okay. And as it would turn out, as she did develop, obviously, just looking at her, I mean, she's kind of taller than average. She's kind of has sort of an elongated sort of. She has the typical sort of elongated, sort of taller, ectomorphic, sort of kind of stretched out looking body, sort of like a model. No, I wouldn't say sexy. I would say more kind of like a model, and kind of tall, sort of long boned, I guess. And as it turns out, she did get involved in a little bit of minor modeling, but in typical Teal Swan fashion, she sort of exaggerated this around her friends and, had stories about going to other countries to do modeling when in all likelihood, she was probably just making that up. Okay. So you do see she already has established, even before we get into the sexual abuse allegations, sort of a tendency to sort of exaggerate and sort of take things that are true, but sort of exaggerate and stretch them to sort of almost hyperbolic, hyperbole, sort of exaggerated proportions. And so basically, we can't ignore that she, the question is really, is she dishonest or is she just an exaggerator, kind of a storyteller? And to me, I have to admit, I haven't really decided what I think. I think, I'm not sure if I think of her as a liar, because I think like Donald Trump, I think she has the instinct. I think she has the performer's instinct to sort of exaggerate for the sake of the performance. Okay, so I think that if I had to be honest, I think I would put Teal Swan sort of in between, sort of halfway between the category of being a liar and being sort of a show person, sort of a performer. Okay. And if you're a performer, you know, hyperbole and exaggeration and storytelling, spinning yarns, basically, that's just that's part of sort of their instinct, you know? So basically, I just don't think, having looked at a lot of videos of Teal Swan, I think she does feel she has a mission in life. Okay. And I do think she feels that she is a person, she's meant to do something in this world, and that she is somebody. Okay. But I just think that deep down inside, I think what she really is a performer. She really is a performer, and she really is sort of a character, you know? And I think she kind of knows that. And so in that context, I think I'm not ready to say that all of her untruths and all of her exaggerations and all of her fiction about herself is actually just normal lying. I think it is kind of, some people have an instinct to create a mythical identity. Okay. And so I think basically, since I do see her as a performer, I think I see her more as myth making and making sort of a legend around herself, as opposed to just being a straight up liar. Okay. Now she may lie. I don't know her personally, and she may have a tendency to lie, but I do think we have to also see that she is a natural performer. And I think there is that instinct. It's almost like a genetic instinct that you have to sort of create sort of a legend around yourself. And that it's only natural that that's going to be a little bit mythical. But I don't know if I want to call that lying, even though it does involve untruths. But I think, you know, there's different ways for things to be untrue. You can be untrue in the sense of just a straight up lie, or it can be mythological. It can be legendary, you know. So I just think she's sort of a larger than life person. And I think she had that instinct to sort of create sort of a legend around herself, because that's just how she presents, you know. And I think she is actually a performer. And like Donald Trump, I think she knows she is sort of a character, sort of a public character, and that there is a certain amount of hyperbole that's going to surround her story, so to speak. And that, you know, some people are sort of fictional people, you know, and that like a true storyteller, you know, her language is not really nonfiction. She's not a non-fictional person. She's more of a fictional person, you know. And that's just a fact. You know, some people are more non-fictional, you know, more journalistic. Some people a little more poetic, and some people are fictional. And I think that she is truly a fictional character, you know. And we have to be sympathetic. You know, what would it be like to be born and to grow up and to see yourself, honestly, inside and outside, to feel that you are truly a fictional character? You know, there's a lot of pros and cons to that, because I think someone who is a fictional character, they know that they're sort of a symbol, and they know that they're sort of like larger than life. You know, like what would happen if you were growing up and you do look like Brad Pitt, or you do look like some actress or something, and you actually look like you should be a model. You know, what was it like to grow up, let's say, being someone like you know, like Cindy Crawford, or, you know, some of these supermodels? You know, on some level, I think deep down inside, you know that you're not just a regular person. You know that you sort of look like you're from another world, you know, and you are sort of larger than life. And so maybe for some people, I think there's almost like it's almost like authentic for them to create sort of a mythology around themselves, because they know that they are themselves sort of a mythological figure, you know. And so I guess when I look at Teal Swan, I mean, I don't think she's the most beautiful person, but she does have that very elongated bone structure. Okay. And she knows that somehow with the hair, that sort of flowing long hair, it sort of creates an image that is sort of fictional. And she sort of does look a little bit like a stylized person and not like a regular person. Okay. So, you know, even just the geometry of her profile and her presentation, I think she almost looks like what an artist would draw, like on the cover of like a romance novel or something. So she sort of does look like a fantastical person. And so I think if she's sort of aware of that intuitively, I think in a sense it almost makes sense that that she would sort of create fiction of herself, because that's actually congruent with how she really presents and how she may really feel on the inside, you know. Now, I don't know how easy it is to live like that, because there has to be a part of her that lives the mundane, prosaic, everyday, non-fictional life. But I think on some level, she knows that she has to have a fictional life as well. She just knows that, and she knows that she is that person. And so, in that sense, okay, I think now we can sort of make sense. We can sort of explain how she could end up with this clearly not factual. It's clearly not factual what she says about the sexual abuse, because the sexual abuse she describes is so outrageous. It's so voluminous. There's so much sexual abuse that she talks about. There's no way that she could be experiencing that level and that volume of sexual abuse and still maintain her basic high school family existence, where she's still living with her family. Her family knows nothing. And she's associating with her friends and neighbors, and they know nothing. And there's no real sign that, she's having that much trouble. Okay, now, on the other hand, from what I gathered from the interview with her neighbor friend, her childhood friend, she did have a lot of psychological problems, and she was seeing psychologists. Okay, and so she did have like instability and psychological issues. Okay, but nothing seems to show up on the level that would, how would you say, like, if she was having so much sexual abuse, okay, during the period that she alleges, even just logistically, she wouldn't be able to also be present and be waking up in the morning at her house and going to school and, just living the 7-day-a-week existence. So in other words, logistically, there's not enough hours in the day to give her time to have all the abuse that she talks about. Because she talks about extensive and repeated sexual abuse that just doesn't seem to fit into her schedule, basically. So, more than likely, okay, I have no idea what kind of abuse she may or may not have experienced. My hunch is that probably she experienced almost no sexual abuse. Okay, I think even if there was some sexual abuse, I think that 95 to 100% of what she's talking about is either just exaggerated or just like her own mythology. Okay, and so why would she do that? I think basically my hunch is that she is a true performer. Okay. And I think she is sort of a larger than life figure. Okay. And so I think that legitimately and authentically, I think that, how would you say, it is lying, but it's also a kind of mythology that makes sense if you feel yourself to be sort of a larger than life person. So I think that deep down inside, even though she probably can't even reconcile it to herself consciously, okay, I think she knew that she had a destiny to be sort of a character, okay, and that in a sense, she's not really a person, but she's sort of a character, okay, and that in a sense that her story had to be outrageous. In other words, I think she felt like she had a destiny to be somewhat famous, okay, I don't know, like super famous, maybe not, but somewhat famous, to make a name for herself publicly. And so I think she knew intuitively, maybe not consciously, but intuitively, I think she knew that she had to make a big story. Okay. And the story had to be hyperbolic, it had to be over the top, and that she is just a person who has a lot of feathers, So if I had to think of two people that she reminds me of, she reminds me a little bit of the, how would you say, what was that shaman that was in the January 6th attack on the Capitol? The right-wing shaman or the MAGA shaman or whatever. Just like all the feathers and all the dress and all the outrageous, presentation. I think in some way, I think Teal Swan feels like she has to have a lot of feathers. She has to have a lot of color. She has to have a lot of story, So I think in a sense, I think the outrageous sexual abuse is just like a lot of feathers. It's a lot of color, basically. It's sort of like, it's like her way of being flamboyant, okay, being over the top. And I think like we see with Donald Trump, I think some people just have an instinct that their life means nothing and they are not themselves if they're not in exaggeration, in hyperbole. Okay. So I think basically, Teal Swan basically created sort of like a fantasy about herself, because I think she herself is a fantasy figure. Okay. And I think she knows that she's a fantasy figure. Okay. And I think she knows that she presents as a fantasy figure, just the way she looks. And that's just what she is. And I think deep down inside, people take her as that. She's a fantasy figure. It's kind of like a porn star, you know. It's sort of like when you see a porn star, like in a porn movie, you know, you're not looking at their reality, but you sort of buy into it because the fantasy makes sense. You know what I mean? And some people are fantasy people, you know. So basically, you know, can I say for sure whether she was not ever abused at all, or whether nobody treated her inappropriately in any sexual way ever? I can't say that. I don't have enough information, but I think that overall, just looking at her upbringing, looking at her personality, looking at the kind of person she seems to be, my guess is that 95 to 100% of what she's talking about as far as the alleged satanic abuse is probably just completely, I'm not going to say made up, but I just think it's just something that she created, okay? Something that came from her to make sense of her fantasy personality, okay? And I think she knew that she had to have a big story to sort of set the tone for her fantasy figure, okay? Because she's like a figure, you know? And I think her figure doesn't make sense if it doesn't have a backstory. And I think in a way to allege like a history of so much satanic sexual abuse, I think it almost gives her like porn credentials, you know? Because it almost makes her kind of like I've seen the worst, you know? So it sort of makes her a badass in a way. And I think indirectly it's her way of saying, you know, I've seen it all, I've been there, I've done that. And, you know, I'm sort of like in a way, kind of like a badass without having to own any association with the satanic stuff, you know? So I think it's kind of like a little bit of a manipulation, because she gets to have all the credentials of all the badass sexuality that she supposedly experienced, but she doesn't have to own the difficult, she doesn't have to own the problem of maybe having believed in Satanism or whatever. So she gets to have all the benefit without paying the price for it. You know what I mean? So it's sort of like, I think it's sort of like her badass sort of street credentials, and it sort of indirectly gives her credentials sort of like indirectly, without saying it, kind of like the sexual goddess that she wants to be seen as. And it also gives her like just street credentials, you know, just like, okay, she's been around the block. She's a badass basically. So, you know, basically, you know, is it lying? Well, technically yes, but I think basically she knows deep down inside that she is a fantasy figure, and she gives people a fantasy to match the figure that she presents. And I think it's something that happens instinctively, intuitively. I think if you tried to really just press her and reason with her, I think she probably wouldn't like that. And I think she probably wouldn't agree with it. But I think probably her prosaic, everyday, non-fictional personality, that part of her personality probably is not very well integrated with her fantasy personality. And I think she knows that she has to maintain that fantasy personality, because that's how she makes it in the world. And she knows there's a lot of profit in that. And so I think just instinctively, I think she probably just doesn't probably want to take the trouble to sort of like integrate those two parts of herself. And so you could never probably really corner her and get her to like cleanly separate those two parts of herself. But I think that basically, you know, what you have is someone who authentically is a fantasy character, and some people do have that. You know, some people are just they're just like living fantasy creatures, you know, living fictional characters, and that's how I see her. So I don't really see her as a straight up liar. I think she just is probably a person who, like L. Ron Hubbard, just probably always, fantasy was probably always a big part of their lives. And for whatever reason, they sort of look like a fantasy person, and they really are kind of the embodiment of a fantasy character. And so that's the life they're stuck with, and they know that it can really profit very well for them, and they can have a lot of success with that, because she actually kind of looks the part. And on top of that, she is kind of intelligent, and she is kind of effective at sort of maintaining sort of a legend about herself, you know. So what can you say? You know, some people can do that, you know. I think for me, I would distinguish that from narcissism, because I think with narcissism, I think there is some of that, but I think it causes much more dysfunction. Okay. And there is, I think with narcissism, sort of a non-congruence or an incongruence between the fantasy that they imagine and the actual capacities that they actually have. And so I think with Teal Swan, I think unfortunately she does look the part, and she is sort of effectively truly sort of, she looks like a fantasy person, and she is sort of the embodiment of sort of a fantasy or a fictional character. So I think she can get away with it. It's not really false. You know what I mean? Whereas I think with narcissism, you might imagine a little more than what you really are. And that incompatibility, that incongruence can get you into trouble, because you're almost like selling yourself to be more than what you can actually deliver, you know? And you're gonna piss people off in life because you present yourself like you can deliver a lot. You sort of overpromise and under deliver. But I think with Teal Swan, I think she actually delivers, in the sense that she really does provide people with a true fantasy character that is just as large as the mythology that she presents about her background. So I'm not prepared to diagnose her as like clinical narcissistic, and yet she does. Her life is all about fantasy, and her life is all about really almost a non-fictional existence. So it's sort of like, if I had to summarize Teal Swan, I would say authentic non-fictional character, authentically nonfiction. It's sort of like, it's not a lie. It's authentic nonfiction. It's authentic fiction. I'm sorry, I said nonfiction, but basically she's authentic fiction. Yeah. So yeah, that's my analysis. I'm sorry if sometimes I have trouble getting the words out, but I just hope people understand, there are a few people out there that are true performers, people kind of like Donald Trump, maybe some rock stars, people who just authentically are sort of fictional. And that's just the way they are, so sorry if I'm kind of mumbling my words today, not really super clear. But I appreciate you watching, and yeah, I'll make another video about the suicide, which is a really important issue, and major controversy that deserves to be talked about. So thanks for watching, and talk to you later.